The day Elijah Bishop received notice that he had exactly one growing season to prove his gold claim was worth the deed. He had been standing in the mud outside the assay office in Durango, Colorado, reading the letter twice before the words fully landed like a fist against his chest. It was the spring of 1879, and the San Juan Mountains were still wearing their white caps like proud old men who refused to acknowledge the warming air below. Elijah was 28 years old, lean and sun-darkened, with calloused hands that told the story of 5 years spent in these mountains more honestly than any letter ever could. He had worked the claim his father had left him, a stretch of creek land up on Copper Ridge that ran along a promising quartz vein, and he had given it everything he had. Yet the Territorial Land Office had grown impatient with minimal production records, and a neighboring mining company run by a man named Gerald Hawthorne had filed a competing interest, arguing that Elijah had failed to work the claim with sufficient industry. 1 season. That was what the letter said. Produce evidence of substantial mineral yield by the 1st of September, or the claim reverts to open filing, and Hawthorne Mining would be right there with their lawyers and their money and their dynamite to swallow it whole. Elijah folded the letter and pushed it into his coat pocket. He walked to the livery stable, saddled his roan mare, and rode back up into the mountains without speaking to anyone. He had always been a man of deliberate silence, the kind of man who thought before he spoke and acted before he complained. But alone on the trail, with the pines crowding the path and the creek running fast with snowmelt, he let himself feel the full weight of what this meant. His father, Thomas Bishop, had died of a fever 3 winters past, and the claim was the last thing on earth that connected Elijah to him. Thomas had believed in Copper Ridge the way some men believed in Scripture. He had spoken about the vein with a reverence that Elijah had once found endearing and later, after years of modest returns, found heartrending. The old man had been right about the gold being there. Elijah had pulled enough color out of the gravel to know the vein was real, but working it alone, with only an occasional hired man and equipment that was aging faster than he could maintain it, had kept him just ahead of ruin without ever pulling him into prosperity. Now he had until September. 4 months of high-altitude summer, and he needed to show results that would hold up to legal scrutiny. He reached the claim by late afternoon. The small cabin his father had built sat tucked against a shelf of granite, solid and weathered. The sluice box ran along the east side of the creek, and the tools were stored in the lean-to out back. Elijah unsaddled the mare and turned her into the small corral, then stood looking at everything with new eyes, calculating what was possible, what was not, and where he stood to fail. He needed help. That much was plain. He needed someone who understood hydraulic work, because the surface gravels were largely played out, and the deeper ground beneath the creek bed was where the real concentration would be. He needed a second pair of skilled hands, and he needed them soon. The trouble was that skilled miners in the San Juans in 1879 were not easy to come by at fair wages. The big silver strikes in Leadville had drawn half the experienced men in the territory north, and those who remained were either already spoken for by the larger operations, or were drifters whose reliability was about as dependable as spring weather. He posted notices in Durango and sent word to Silverton. He was prepared to offer wages and a percentage of whatever they pulled, which was more than most small claimants would offer. Then he waited, kept working, and tried not to count the days. 3 weeks passed before anyone came. He heard the horse first, a steady, unhurried pace on the trail below the cabin, and he straightened up from the sluice box with his back aching and his boots soaked to the ankle, pushing wet hair from his forehead. It was a Tuesday morning in late April, and the sky was doing what Colorado skies did in April, which was being beautiful and threatening simultaneously. The rider that came around the bend of the trail was a woman. She was riding a steel-gray horse with the easy confidence of someone who had grown up in the saddle, not gripping the reins tight, but letting them rest loose in her fingers. She wore a canvas work coat over a plain dark skirt and practical boots, and her dark auburn hair was pinned up under a broad-brimmed hat that had seen considerable weather. She was not young in the fragile way that some men preferred, but she was young, somewhere in the middle of her 20s, with a face that carried intelligence and a composed kind of steadiness that Elijah noticed immediately. She stopped her horse at a reasonable distance and looked at him directly, the way a person looks when they are accustomed to being assessed and have long since decided not to mind it. "I am looking for the Bishop claim on Copper Ridge," she said. Her voice was clear and measured. "The man at the livery in Durango said this trail." "You found it," Elijah said. He set down the shovel he had been holding and wiped his hand on his trousers. "I am Elijah Bishop." "Hazel Hale," she said. She reached into her coat and produced a folded piece of paper which she held out toward him. "I am answering your notice." Elijah did not move for a moment. He was recalculating things quickly, the way a man does when something he had not accounted for presents itself, and he is not sure whether to be relieved or cautious. He had expected a man. He had pictured a weathered, experienced miner, someone grizzled and sure, someone who would pick up a pickaxe and need no instruction. He walked forward and took the paper from her hand. She let him read it, which was his own notice, without saying anything to fill the silence. That alone told him something. "You have experience with hydraulic mining?" he asked. "My father ran a placer operation in Nevada for 11 years, Hazel Hale said. "Before that he worked for a hydraulic company out of California. I worked alongside him from the time I was 14 until he passed 2 years ago. I know how to read creek gravel, how to grade a sluice box, how to calculate water pressure, and I can identify a quartz gold vein by examining the host rock. I also know basic assay work, though I have not got a license for it." Elijah looked at her. "That is a considerable list. You needed someone with skills," she said simply. "I have them." He looked back at the creek and the modest operation he had been running, then at the steep hillside above where the quartz vein disappeared under overburden. He thought about the letter in his coat pocket and the 1st of September and Gerald Hawthorne waiting like a well-dressed vulture in Durango. "I will be honest with you," he said. "The work is hard and the living is rough. The cabin has one room with a loft. I cannot offer comfortable quarters." "I have slept in worse," Hazel said, and there was no complaint in her voice, only the calm reporting of a fact. "The pay I offered in the notice stands," he said. "Wages and 5% of yield." "I want 10%, she said. He almost smiled despite himself. 7.5. "Done," she said, and swung down from the horse with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it all her life. What happened in the first week was not romance. It was work, and it was the kind of thorough, methodical, exhausting work that either breaks a partnership or forges one. Hazel assessed the claim with a seriousness that Elijah found both impressive and slightly humbling. She walked every yard of the creek, crouching to examine the gravel bars, picking up rocks and studying them, reading the way the water moved. She climbed the hillside and looked at the quartz vein with her hand shading her eyes, and she asked him questions he had not thought to ask himself. "How deep is the bedrock under the main channel?" she asked on the second morning. "I have not probed it completely," he admitted. She looked at him with an expression that was not judgment exactly, but was frank. "That is the first thing we need to know," she said. "The gold is sitting on bedrock. If we do not know how far down it is, we are guessing at how to get to it." She took the iron probe rod and began methodically probing the creek bottom in intervals, recording her findings with marks on a rough map she had drawn herself. A map that was more precise than anything Elijah had made in 5 years on the claim. By the end of the second day, she had a working picture of the creek bed's contours that told them both where the deepest gold-bearing gravels were likely concentrated. "Here," she said, putting her finger on a bend in the creek where the channel curved and the bedrock dipped into a natural trap. "This is where we concentrate." Elijah looked at the map. She was right. He could see it now that she had drawn it plainly. The natural forces of water movement over years would have deposited the heaviest minerals precisely where she was pointing. He felt a complicated mixture of admiration and sheepishness, because he had worked around that bend for years without understanding its significance. "I have been running the sluice upstream of that point," he said. "I know," she said, not unkindly. "We will move it." Moving the sluice box was a full day's work that left them both sore and filthy. But by the end of it, the equipment was positioned correctly, and the water was running through it with better grade. Hazel adjusted the riffles inside the box with careful attention, showing Elijah the angle that would catch the fine gold without losing it over the edges. Her hands were quick and sure, and she explained everything she did as she did it, not in the manner of a person who wants credit for their knowledge, but in the manner of a person who wants to be useful. The cabin at night was an exercise in careful distance. Hazel had climbed to the loft with her blankets and her small traveling bag and established it as her territory without making any pronouncement about it. Elijah slept below by the stove, and they kept their private lives orderly and separate. She was not cold exactly, but she was contained, the way a person is who has learned to rely on themselves. On the third evening she made supper from the provisions she had brought, a proper stew with dried beans and salt pork and wild onions she had found along the creek bank, and the smell of it filled the cabin with something that felt like civilization, which Elijah had not quite realized he missed until he was sitting down to it. "Where were you before Durango?" he asked. It was the first question he had asked that was not about the work. She was quiet for a moment, ladling her own bowl. "I was in New Mexico territory for a year," she said. "Before that, Arizona, moving around. My father died and there was nothing to keep me in Nevada," she said plainly. "I have been finding work where I can find it." "Has it been difficult?" he asked. "Finding work, I mean, for a woman." She looked at him steadily across the small table. "Every single time," she said, "without exception. You are the first person who offered me wages that were not an insult." He felt the weight of that. He had not given much thought to it before she arrived, if he was being honest. He had wanted skilled hands, and she had those hands. But hearing her say, it plainly brought into focus something about the world she was navigating that he had never had to consider for himself. "Well," he said, "I am glad the notice found you." She looked at her stew. "So am I," she said quietly. The first week turned to two, and the work began to show results. With the sluice repositioned and the effort focused on the productive bend, they were pulling color out of the box every day, not fortunes yet, but encouraging amounts of fine gold that were considerably better than anything Elijah had managed on his own. Hazel had also begun examining the quartz vein on the hillside in earnest, spending an hour each morning above the creek with a hand lens, chipping samples with a small hammer, and examining the fracture patterns. One morning she came back down the slope with a piece of quartz the size of her fist, and she handed it to him without speaking. He turned it over. Even in the morning light, the gold was visible, not trace color but actual free gold showing in the pale gray quartz like veins of something miraculous. "It gets richer to the northeast," she said. "The vein is pitching that way, probably deeper. If we can get to it before September, you will have all the evidence you need." "That would mean hard rock mining," he said. "Drilling, blasting." "Yes. I only have a small amount of powder." "I know what you have," she said. "I inventoried the lean-to the first day." He stared at her. "You inventoried the lean-to?" "Of course I did," she said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "You cannot plan a campaign without knowing your resources. You have enough powder for 3 charges, some additional drill steel, and 2 hammers that are still serviceable. It will not be enough for a full drift, but it might be enough to expose the vein on the surface sufficiently to take proper samples. Samples are what you need for the legal filing." Elijah sat down on a nearby boulder. He was looking at the quartz specimen in his hands, at the gold caught in the rock, and he was looking at Hazel Hale, who was standing with the morning sun on her face and her arms folded with a practical air. And he was aware, suddenly, and without quite knowing how it had crept up on him, that she had changed every calculation he had made. He had figured the math of this season as a single man working alone with help. He had figured it as a desperate scramble that might or might not succeed. Now the numbers looked different. The questions she had asked, and the answers she had found, and the reorientation of their effort had shifted the odds in a way that he had not dared to hope for 3 weeks ago. He did not say any of that. He handed the quartz specimen back to her and said, "All right, walk me through it." There were days when the mountains made their opinions about human ambition known in no uncertain terms. The third week of May brought a late storm that dropped 2 feet of snow on Copper Ridge and kept them confined to the cabin for 3 days. The work stopped entirely, and Elijah sat at the table feeling every lost hour like a splinter under his skin while Hazel, with a composure that he was beginning to recognize as characteristic of her fundamental nature, organized every document, record, and assay note they had produced so far into a coherent log. "What are you doing?" he asked on the second snowbound day. "Preparing your case," she said, not looking up from the paper. "When you go to the land office in August, you will need documentation, production records with dates, amounts, and methods, sample assay results, a map of the claim with the vein location marked. The more thorough it is, the harder it will be for Hawthorne to challenge it." He watched her write in her neat, careful hand. "You have done this kind of thing before," he said. "I helped my father do it 3 times," she said. "He was not a man for paperwork, so it fell to me. We only lost one of those filings, and that was because the other party had a judge in his pocket." She paused, and something moved briefly across her face that might have been old pain. "That is a different kind of problem than the one you have. Is Hawthorne that kind of man?" Elijah asked. "The kind with a judge?" "I do not know him," she said. "Do you?" "He is new to the region," Elijah said. "Came up from Denver 2 years ago with a great deal of money and an ambition about the size of the Rocky Mountains. He has bought out 3 smaller claims already, not all of them willingly." Hazel set down her pen and looked at him. "Has he done anything directly to you?" "He offered to buy me out last fall," Elijah said. "His offer was about 1/4 of what the claim is worth, even with modest production." "And when you refused?" "That is when the competing interest got filed," Elijah said. Hazel was quiet for a moment. Outside the cabin, the wind pushed snow against the single small window in a soft, relentless whisper. "Then we make the documentation so complete and the production record so strong that there is no legal foothold for a challenge," she said. "We do not let the outcome rest on anything other than the strength of the claim itself." He looked at her. "You think like a lawyer." "I think like a woman who has watched men lose things they should not have lost," she said, and she picked up her pen and went back to writing. On the 3rd day the snow stopped, and the sun came out with that ferocious, high-altitude brilliance that makes everything look etched in silver. They were both out the door before the snow had fully settled, eager to get back to work, and they stood for a moment on the slope looking down at the white-covered valley and the dark green of the pines below and the creek still running through the white, indifferent to weather, as creeks always are. "It is beautiful up here," Hazel said, and her voice had lost some of its practical composure, just a crack of openness that he had not heard before. "My father used to say it was the most honest landscape he had ever seen," Elijah said. "He meant that it does not pretend to be easy." She turned and looked at him, and for just a moment he saw something in her face that was not the competent, measured woman he had been working alongside, but something quieter and more uncertain, someone who was moved by beauty and trying not to show it too plainly. Then it was gone, and she was saying, "We should get the sluice cleared before the melt comes down fast this afternoon," and she was already walking down the slope. He watched her go for 3 seconds before he followed, and in those 3 seconds he was aware of something shifting in his chest like a plank coming loose in a wall, letting in unexpected light. June came and brought genuine warmth. The creek ran high with snowmelt, and they worked hard to manage the increased water flow through the sluice, adjusting the grade and the riffle spacing to handle the volume. Hazel was in the creek every day, sometimes knee-deep, with the water cold enough to make your teeth ache, and she never complained once. She worked with a kind of focused physical joy that Elijah found unexpectedly stirring to witness, the pleasure of someone who has found the right work for their particular abilities. He began to know her in the way that extended shared labor creates knowledge, in the grain of it, in the particular way she held her shoulders when she was concentrating versus when she was merely doing, in the angle of her hat when she was genuinely puzzled by something, in the sound of her laugh which came rarely but was a real and unpretentious thing when it arrived. It arrived one afternoon when Elijah, attempting to redirect a side channel with a makeshift dam of rocks and clay, misjudged the pressure, and the whole arrangement came apart in a sudden cold rush that soaked him from the waist down and sent his hat spinning downstream. He stood there in the wreckage of his dam, cold and dripping, and Hazel, who had seen the whole thing from the bank, pressed her hand over her mouth and her shoulders shook. "You can laugh," he said, with as much dignity as a wet man can manage. She laughed. It was open and genuine, and it transformed her face completely, and he stood in the creek soaked to the skin and grinning back at her like an idiot, and something between them shifted for good. After that the distance was different. Not gone, not suddenly intimate, but warmer and more honest, the way two people are when they have stopped performing careful neutrality and have simply agreed to be themselves. Supper conversations in the cabin grew longer. She told him about Nevada, about her father, a man named Hazel Hale who had been brilliant with water and gravel and stubbornly hopeless with money, who had loved his daughter and taught her everything he knew and left her nothing when he died except that knowledge and a good horse. "Were you ever married?" Elijah asked one evening, and then immediately felt the bluntness of it. She did not seem to mind. "No," she said. "I was close once in Nevada. A man named Arthur Crane. He was kind enough, but he wanted a woman who would stop working, and he never quite said so directly, which was the part I could not forgive. He kept waiting for me to become someone different." She paused. "What about you?" "No," Elijah said. "I have been up here mostly. It does not lend itself to courtship." "No," she agreed and looked at the fire, and there was a thoughtful quality to her silence that he chose not to press. The drilling began in mid-June. Elijah had experience with single-jack drilling, the technique of hammering a drill steel with one hand and rotating it with the other to bore a hole into hard rock for a blasting charge. It was slow and arm-punishing work, and Hazel watched the first session with close attention, then asked to try it herself. "You do not have to," he said. "I know how it is done," she said. "My father did hard rock work for a season in Nevada. Show me what you need here." He showed her. She worked the hammer with less force than he did but better rhythm, and she learned the rotation of the drill steel quickly. They fell into a pattern where he drove the steel and she rotated, which was a two-person technique called double jack that was considerably faster and more effective than single jack work. It was close physical work, the hammer swinging past within inches, requiring absolute trust and coordination. The first time they completed a hole and placed the charge and lit the fuse and stood back. The explosion was a flat crack that echoed off the granite above and brought down a section of the hillside in a cloud of pale dust. And when the dust settled and they walked in to examine what was exposed, the quartz vein was there in the fresh rock face, broader and richer than the surface had suggested, laced with the unmistakable color of gold running through it in threads that caught the afternoon light. Elijah stood before it with his hand resting on the rock and his throat tight. Hazel stood beside him, and her shoulder was nearly touching his, and she said quietly, "Your father was right." He could not speak for a moment. When he did, his voice was rougher than usual. He spent a lot of years believing in this hill. "The hill deserved it," she said. He turned and looked at her, and she was looking at the rock face with a kind of respectful satisfaction, and he thought, with sudden clarity, that he had never in his life wanted to be known by someone as much as he wanted this woman to know him. Not to impress her. Simply to be understood by her, the way she understood the creek and the gravel and the quartz vein, with accuracy and without pretense. He did not say it. It was June, and there were 3 months still to work through, and things between them were still finding their shape, and he was a deliberate man. But he carried the feeling with him like something warm in his coat pocket. July was the heart of the season, long days and high clear skies, the mountains in their full summer, and the work at its most productive and demanding. They had hired a third pair of hands for the hydraulic work, a quiet older man named Pete Rowan, who had worked placer operations all over the territory, and who accepted Hazel's direction without a flicker of surprise, which told Elijah something about Pete Rowan that he appreciated. With 3 people working and the operation properly organized, the gold they were pulling from the creek bed and from the hard rock exposure on the hillside was accumulating to something genuinely significant. Hazel kept the records with painstaking attention, weighing and recording every cleanup, noting the sample locations, building the documented case for the land office with the methodical care of someone who understood that paper could win what muscle alone could not. Elijah watched her sometimes in the evenings going over the records at the table with a lamp burning down, and her hair escaping from its pins in the way it always did by evening, and he felt something for her that went beyond admiration, something that was mixed in with the land and the season and the work. Something that had been growing so steadily and so quietly that he had not fully acknowledged it until the evening in early July when she looked up from the records and found him watching and did not look away. There was a moment that stretched between them, neither long nor short, just charged and still, and then she said, "The July tally is the best we have had." "I know," he said. "You have been keeping it." "Elijah," she said, and then stopped. "Hazel," he said. She looked at him with that direct, honest gaze of hers, and what she said was, "I am not accustomed to being where I am wanted." He crossed the cabin slowly, not in any rush, and sat down across from her, close enough that he could see the lamplight in her brown eyes. "Then I want to be clear about it," he said. "You are wanted here, not just for the work, though you are the best partner this claim has ever had. I mean you, the person that you are." She was quiet for a long moment. He could see her weighing it, which was characteristic of her, this habit of measuring things carefully before she acted. He did not rush her. He had learned that patience with Hazel was not waiting, it was respect. "I have moved a great deal," she said finally. "I have not let myself become attached to places or to people, because the loss of things is very hard once you have allowed yourself to want them." "I know something about that," he said. "I know you do," she said. She looked down at the records on the table, at the careful columns of numbers and dates, at the map of the claim in her own hand. "This place feels different," she said. "You feel different." "Different how?" he asked, because he wanted to hear her say it plainly, the way she said everything. She looked up at him. "Like something I would not want to leave," she said. He reached across the table and laid his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and held it, and that was how it began between them. Not with great declarations or sweeping gestures, because neither of them were people of great declarations or sweeping gestures, but with honesty and with held hands in lamplight, which was a beginning that suited them both absolutely. What followed was a courtship that unfolded against the backdrop of the work, because neither of them could quite separate what they felt from what they were building together. There were evenings when they sat outside the cabin after Pete had gone to his tent, and the mountains were purple in the late light, and they talked the way people talk when they have decided to trust each other, openly and without performance. She told him about her mother, who had died of fever when Hazel was 11, and about the years after when she had followed her father from camp to camp across Nevada and Arizona, learning the work because there was nothing else to do, because work was how her father expressed love, and so work was how she understood it too. He told her about his father, about Thomas Bishop's unshakable belief in Copper Ridge, about the long winters up here when Elijah had been young and his father had sat at the same table with maps and figures, and a kind of faith that Elijah had found both moving and frightening, the faith of a man staking his whole life on a piece of ground. "And now you are doing the same," she said. "With better support," he said, and smiled at her, and she leaned her shoulder against his and did not move away. He kissed her for the first time on an evening in mid-July when they had come back from examining the hard rock face on the hillside, and she had showed him a new pocket of rich ore she had found by probing along the vein to the northeast, just as she had predicted. The light was golden, and the mountains were enormous around them, and she was holding the ore sample with both hands and telling him what it meant for the September filing, and he was listening to her voice and watching her face, and he simply could not do it any longer. He put his hand on her jaw and turned her face toward him and kissed her, gently and then less gently, and she was still holding the rock sample for a moment, and then she set it down on a boulder and kissed him back with a focused sincerity that was entirely her own. When they separated, she looked at him with that steady brown gaze and said, "I have been waiting for you to do that for about 3 weeks." "I was being deliberate," he said. "You were being absurdly patient," she said, and he laughed, and she laughed, and on the hillside above the gold country of Copper Ridge with the summer burning around them, something was settled between them that felt permanent and right. Pete Rowan, who was a man of very few words and exceptional discretion, noticed the change in the atmosphere of the camp the next morning and said nothing about it. He showed up, did his work, ate his supper, and minded his own business with the serenity of a man who has seen enough of the world to find young people falling in love entirely unremarkable. Elijah appreciated this about Pete Rowan enormously. The work in late July took on a different quality, still serious, still urgent, but with an undercurrent of happiness that changed the texture of the days. Elijah and Hazel worked in close coordination, their movements grown familiar with practice, the double jack drilling a conversation in hammer blows and rotation, the sluice work a shared rhythm. She knew how he thought now, and he knew how she thought, and they could communicate about the work with half-sentences and gestures, which is a particular kind of intimacy that is not romantic in its mechanics, but is romantic in its effect. Gerald Hawthorne arrived at the claim on the 15th of July, which was not unexpected. He came with a man who appeared to be a legal representative and 2 others whose purpose was less clear and more physical, and he came with the confident bearing of a man who believes the conclusion of a matter is already settled. He was perhaps 50, gray-haired and well-dressed in the way that men from Denver were well-dressed, which was precisely inappropriately for mountain terrain. His eyes were quick and assessing. He looked at the operation, at the sluice and the visible hard rock work on the hillside, and Elijah saw him making his own calculations with a small, tight movement of his jaw. "Bishop," he said, "I wanted to see how things stood up here. I have an interest in the matter, as you know." "You do," Elijah said. He stood in the clearing before the cabin with his arms at his sides, and he was aware of Hazel coming up behind him to his left, wiping her hands on a cloth, standing at a slight angle that was quiet but present. Hawthorne's eyes moved to Hazel with a kind of speculative blankness. "Hired hands," he said. "Partners," Hazel said pleasantly, and there was a quality in the word that made it not an answer but a statement. Hawthorne looked back at Elijah. "I will be direct. I am here to make a new offer, more generous than the last. It would be a clean exit, Bishop, and you would have money in your pocket rather than what you have got now." He paused, "which appears to be a great deal of effort for uncertain return." "The return is not uncertain," Elijah said. "It is documented." Something shifted in Hawthorne's expression. He looked again at the hard rock face on the hillside, at the fresh scars in the quartz, at the sluice running well-positioned and productive. He looked at Hazel's records log, which was sitting closed on the stump outside the cabin door. He was a man who could read a situation, which was presumably how he had got as far as he had, and Elijah could see him reading this one and not entirely liking what he read. "You have until September," Hawthorne said. "I will remind you of that." "You do not need to remind me," Elijah said. Hawthorne looked at him for a long moment with the measuring look of a man deciding something. Then he turned and went back to his horse. His legal representative scribbled something in a notebook. The other 2 men said nothing, which was consistent with their apparent purpose. When they had gone down the trail and out of sight, Pete Rowan, who had observed the entire exchange from the linta without appearing to move, ambled over and said, "That is a man who does not like being surprised," which was about as analytical as Pete Rowan ever got. "No," Hazel agreed. She picked up her records log from the stump and held it against her chest. He was recalculating when he saw the hard rock work. He expected to find a played-out surface operation. "What does that mean for us?" Elijah asked. "It means he will look for another angle," she said. "He will not come back here again. He will work through the legal process." She was quiet for a moment. "We need to get to Durango before September. We need an attorney." "I cannot afford much of one," Elijah said. "Find the best one available," she said. "I will contribute my wages from this season to the legal cost. Consider it invested." He looked at her. "Hazel, I cannot let you do that." "You are not letting me," she said. "I am choosing to. There is a difference and it matters." She met his eyes. "I have a stake in this outcome, in more ways than one." He understood what she meant by more ways than one. He let it stand as she had meant it. She went to Durango herself in late July, a 3-day trip down the mountain and back, and she came back with a lawyer named Charles Whitfield, who had a long jaw and a reputation for mining claim litigation that was considered sound. She also came back with the registration of a new formal survey of the claim that she had commissioned from the county surveyor, a document that fixed the boundaries precisely and established Elijah's continuous habitation and work on the land with legal exactitude. Whitfield rode up to the claim the following week, spent 2 days reviewing all of Hazel's documentation, examining the creek and the hard rock workings, and talking to Pete Rowan, whose brief and factual testimony about the operation's productivity he recorded in a deposition. At the end of his visit, he sat at the table in the cabin with Elijah and Hazel across from him, and he said, "This is one of the strongest continuous claim records I have reviewed. The documentation of yield is thorough, and the production evidence is substantive. If this goes before the land office examiner, I believe you will prevail." Elijah felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight since April. "And if Hawthorne's people push it to litigation?" Hazel asked. "That is more costly in time and money," Whitfield said carefully. "But the documentary foundation is solid. I would rather be on your side of this table than his." After Whitfield had gone, Elijah sat outside the cabin in the warm evening and looked at his mountains and his creek and his quartz vein on the hillside. And he thought about his father, who had believed in this place without ever quite getting what he believed was in it. And he thought about what it meant that the belief had turned out to be correct. Hazel came out and sat beside him on the bench against the cabin wall, close enough that her shoulder rested against his arm. "Your father would be pleased," she said. "He would be insufferable," Elijah said. "He would say he told me so every morning for a month," she smiled. "Then he would be pleased and insufferable." "Yes." Elijah looked at her. The evening light was in her hair and on her face, and the mountains were going dark behind her, and he thought that the thing he was about to say had been settling toward the surface for weeks and had simply arrived. "Hazel," he said, "I need to ask you something." She turned to look at him with that direct, patient gaze. "When September comes," he said, "and the claim is secure, what is your plan?" She was quiet for a moment. "I have not made one," she said. "I have been finding it unusually difficult to think past the end of this season." "I have a thought about that," he said. "Tell me." He was not a man for elaborate speeches, and he did not make one. "Stay," he said. "Not as my partner on the claim, though you would always be that too if you wanted. Stay because I intend to spend the rest of my life on this mountain, and I would like it very much if you were here for that. Stay because this place suits you, and you have already made it better than I could have made it alone. Stay because I am in love with you, and I would like to ask you to marry me, though I will not press you for an answer tonight if you need time." Hazel looked at him for a long moment. He could not tell what she was thinking, which was unusual because he had come to know her expressions fairly well, but this was a different quality of still. Then she said, "I have been in love with you since the day you stood in the creek soaking wet and laughed at yourself." He blinked. "That was 6 weeks ago." "I know," she said. I told you I had been waiting 3 weeks for you to kiss me. I was understating it." He laughed, and she was smiling at him with the full, unguarded version of her smile that he had only begun to see in the last few weeks, the one that reached her eyes and changed her whole face, and he took her hands and said, "Is that a yes?" "Yes," she said. "That is a yes." He kissed her in the mountain dusk with the creek running below and the first stars coming out above, and the claim was not yet secured, but his life was, in the way that matters. August was the final push. They worked with the urgency of people who understand that a clock is running, but also with a steadiness that comes from knowing the work and trusting each other absolutely. Pete Rowan matched their pace without complaint, and the accumulated gold from the season was now substantial, weighed and recorded and held in a locked box that Elijah had bolted to the floor beneath a floorboard, a detail that had been Hazel's suggestion. The hard rock face yielded one more good blast in early August, opening a section of the vein that showed the richest ore they had yet found, and Hazel took samples from every foot of the exposed face and labeled them with the care of someone preparing legal evidence, which was exactly what they were. She sent a letter to Whitfield with a full production summary. She also did something that Elijah had not asked her to do, and that demonstrated, when he found out about it, the precise caliber of her intelligence. She had written, through Whitfield, to the Territorial Land Office in advance of their September filing, formally registering the claim as actively worked and substantially productive, with documentation attached, so that when September arrived the examiner would already have preliminary evidence in hand before Hawthorne's people could object. "When did you do that?" he asked. "3 weeks ago," she said. "You did not tell me." "I did not want you to worry about it if it did not work," she said. "And I wanted to be sure the documentation was complete before I submitted it." He looked at her for a long moment. "Hazel Hale," he said, "you are a remarkable person." She looked mildly embarrassed, which was endearing because she was not usually a person who showed embarrassment. "I am a person who thinks ahead," she said, "and who does not like losing things that should not be lost." "No," he said gently, "you are remarkable." The color in her face deepened slightly, and she said, "We still have 2 weeks of work to do," and picked up her hammer, and he let her have the deflection because he had already said what was true and there was no need to repeat it. The last 2 weeks of the season were high and golden. The aspens on the lower slopes were beginning to think about turning, the first blush of yellow-green that would become brilliant gold in September, which Elijah had always found beautiful, and which now seemed to him appropriate beyond coincidence. The work was winding toward its close with a satisfaction that was different from the desperation that had opened the season, the difference between a storm that might sink you and a tide that is coming in. Hazel finished the documentation log in the 3rd week of August, and it was, by any reasonable assessment, a masterwork of organizational clarity. Whitfield had reviewed the draft and said he had never seen a mining claim record put together with such completeness, which was high praise from a man who examined such documents professionally. The log ran to 47 pages with maps and sample assay results and daily production records, and a geological description of the quartz vein that Hazel had written herself based on everything her father had taught her and everything she had observed firsthand. Pete Rowan left the claim on the 25th of August with his wages paid, and his respect for both of them evident in the quiet thoroughness of his leave-taking. He shook Elijah's hand, and then he looked at Hazel and said, "I have worked with a lot of people on a lot of claims, Miss Hale. This was the best organized operation I have been part of. You are a credit to the work," which was the longest speech anyone had ever heard Pete Rowan make, and Hazel thanked him with a directness that acknowledged the rarity and the sincerity of it. They rode to Durango together in early September, Elijah on his roan mare and Hazel on her steel gray, with the documentation locked in the saddlebag, and the gold they were depositing at the assay office wrapped in chamois cloth inside a separate bag. The trail down from the mountains was bright and clear, the aspens now fully turning, and the morning air was the particular cool of early September in the high country, the air that says summer is ending but has not quite let go yet. Whitfield met them at the land office. Gerald Hawthorne's legal representative was also there, a thin man named Treadwell who had sharp eyes and a sharper suit, and who looked at the documentation Hazel had assembled with an expression that went through several stages, starting with dismissiveness and arriving at something closer to unease. The land office examiner was a careful man named Morrison who had been doing this work for 15 years and who read documents the way other men might read a good novel, with steady absorption and occasional pauses for reflection. He spent 40 minutes with Hazel's log before he said anything, and what he said was, "This is comprehensive." Treadwell raised an objection about the continuity of work record, claiming it reflected gaps in production. Whitfield cited 4 specific entries in the log that demonstrated uninterrupted daily activity, with weather exceptions noted by date and backed by Pete Rowan's deposition. Treadwell raised an objection about the hard rock work being beyond the scope of the original surface claim filing. Whitfield pointed to the territorial mining code language that explicitly permitted development of any vein identified within the claim boundary. Hazel sat beside Elijah throughout this exchange, with her hands folded on the table and her posture precise and her face composed. She had given Whitfield everything he needed. The argument was his to make in the forum. But Elijah could feel the quality of her attention, the way she tracked every exchange with the focused concentration of someone who has put a great deal of work into a result and will not look away from it. When Morrison closed the documentation log and looked up, he said, "The claim record is substantiated. The continuous work requirement is satisfied. The production evidence is more than sufficient to meet the seasonal threshold." He looked at Treadwell without particular expression. "The competing interest application by Hawthorne Mining is denied for insufficient grounds. The Bishop claim on Copper Ridge is confirmed." The room was quiet for a moment. Elijah felt it move through him like water, the release of the pressure that had been in him since that day in April outside this same building when he had read the letter in the mud. He breathed out slowly and completely. Treadwell gathered his papers with a controlled movement that did not quite conceal his frustration and left the room without additional comment. Whitfield shook Elijah's hand with a warmth that was genuine, then Hazel's with equal warmth, saying, "The documentation was the whole of it. I want you to know that. A lesser record and it would have been more contested." After Whitfield had gone and they had seen to the assay deposit, they were alone in the street outside the land office in the September morning, the mountains visible above the buildings of Durango, white-capped and enormous and enduring. Elijah turned to her. There were things he wanted to say about what this morning had meant, about the claim and his father and the season that had just ended, but what came out first was her name. Hazel. She looked at him. Her hat was a little sideways from the ride down, and there was a mark of trail dust on her coat, and she was looking at him with the steady, direct gaze that he had come to need the way other men needed water. "You saved it," he said. "Truly. I want you to understand that. I had the land and the belief in it, but what you brought here changed every calculation I had made. I did not see how to do this until you came." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "We saved it," with a quiet emphasis on the first word that was characteristic of her, this insistence on accuracy. "We saved it," he agreed. She reached out and straightened the front of his coat, a small gesture that was entirely practical and also entirely personal, and then she left her hand there for a moment. "I would like to go back up the mountain," she said. "I find I am very attached to that view." "So am I," he said, and covered her hand with his. They were married in Durango 3 weeks later, in the parlor of a respectable boarding house whose owner, a woman named Clara Briggs, had taken an immediate liking to Hazel and offered her premises with genuine warmth. It was not a large ceremony. Whitfield attended, and Clara Briggs and her husband, and Pete Rowan, who appeared in a clean shirt looking somewhat formal and considerably pleased, and a handful of other people from the town who had come to know Elijah over the years. Hazel wore a dress of dark green wool that she had bought in Durango the week before, practical and well-made, and she stood beside Elijah in front of the traveling preacher with the straightforward composure that she brought to everything, saying her words clearly and looking at him with the full openness that she had learned to allow herself, the open version of her that she had been protective of for a long time and had now placed in his keeping. Elijah said his words and looked at her, and felt that he was the most settled he had ever been in his life, which was a thing he had not expected to feel in a parlor in Durango in October of 1879, and which he considered an extraordinary gift. Pete Rowan said, after the ceremony was done and there was a modest celebration with food and cider, that he had never seen two people who understood each other as quickly or as well, which was the most romantic thing Pete Rowan was ever going to say to anyone, and everyone present understood this. They rode back up to Copper Ridge on a clear October day, the aspens fully golden now, the mountains wearing their autumn with the same unself-conscious grandeur with which they wore everything. The cabin was cold when they arrived, and they built the fire together, and got the horses settled, and stood in the main room looking at each other in the warm light of the first evening of their marriage. She looked at him and said, "I want to expand the sluice operation next spring. I have some ideas about the northeast section of the creek that I did not have time to properly develop this season." He laughed. He laughed from somewhere deep and real and entirely happy. "Of course you do," he said. "Also," she said, with a quieter kind of smile, "I think the cabin needs another room." He looked around the single-room space and up at the loft and then back at her with a question in his face. "Not immediately," she said, "but I think eventually." He crossed the room to her in 2 steps and took her face in his hands and kissed her, and she kissed him back with all the honest warmth that was the truest thing about her, and the fire crackled, and the mountains were enormous outside the small windows, and Copper Ridge held them the way good land holds the people who have earned it. The winter that followed was long and snow-deep and entirely right. Hazel ordered a proper collection of geological survey literature from a bookseller in Denver, and it arrived on the December mail run in a large crate that took both of them to carry up from the trailhead, and she read through it over the winter evenings with a focused pleasure while Elijah sat across from her with his own reading or his own planning. And they talked, as they always talked, openly and at length about the things that interested them, which were many and varied and never exhausted. She also had tools brought up, proper drafting instruments, and she began drawing a detailed map of the entire Copper Ridge system, creek and vein and overburden and all, a map that was more complete and accurate than anything in the county records. It was the work of the winter months, and it was beautiful, precise lines on heavy paper, the kind of document that would serve the claim for generations. He watched her work on it and understood that this was her version of his father's faith in the land, this careful documentation of everything that was real and true about the place, this refusal to let the mountain be vague or uncertain on paper when it was so specific and particular in reality. In the spring she was pregnant, which they had hoped for, and which arrived with a timing that made everything feel orderly and full of good sense. She told him on a March morning when the snow was still deep, but the light had changed in the way it changes in March, angling differently, promising. She simply said, "I'm going to have a child," in the same tone in which she told him the elevation of the bedrock at any given point in the creek, factual and certain and pleased. He held her for a long time in the cabin doorway while the mountains were white and wide around them, and she let herself be held, which was something she had learned to do over the winter, to accept the holding without the instinct to stand separate. They had talked about whether to leave the mountain for the confinement, but Hazel, who had assessed the practicalities with her characteristic thoroughness, had determined that a local midwife from the Ute community who lived in the valley below and who was known throughout the region for her competence could be arranged, and that the cabin, properly expanded, could accommodate a child with no difficulty. The expansion she had mentioned in October was built before May by Elijah and Pete Rowan, who had come back to the claim for another season with the equanimity of a man who has found good work and sees no reason to leave it. The new room was simple and solid, built of the same materials as the original cabin, and Hazel organized it with the same precise attention she brought to the record's log, a proper place for everything, which was the way she needed the world to be, and which was the way Elijah Bishop was entirely willing to provide. The summer of 1880 was gentler in its demands than the summer of 1879 had been. The claim was secure now and producing steadily, not making them rich in the extravagant sense, but producing with a consistency that made real planning possible. Hazel managed the operation from the cabin in her later months, directing the creek work from the bank with the same authority she had always had, refusing to be managed by her own body's changes beyond what was genuinely necessary. The baby arrived in late October of 1880, attended by the midwife, a composed and practical woman named Mary who had delivered children in these mountains for 30 years, and who found Hazel's focused practical approach to labor entirely sensible. It was a boy, healthy and loud, with Elijah's dark coloring, and Elijah thought some quality in his expression even in those first days that suggested he had inherited his mother's fundamental characteristic, which was the disposition to look at everything with direct and assessing interest. They named him Thomas, for Elijah's father. Elijah held his son on the evening of his birth and stood at the window of the new room with the mountains dark and starbright outside, and felt something so large that he had no useful word for it, only the wordless knowledge that this was the life Thomas Bishop Sr. had believed in and had not quite reached, the life that the mountain had always been capable of sustaining for the people willing to understand it. Hazel was asleep and Elijah stood with his son and was grateful to her in a way that went deeper than gratitude. That was the kind of feeling that takes the form of daily choices rather than occasional expression. The way you continue to love a person by continuing to know them and to believe in them and to do the work of life alongside them. When she woke and he brought the baby to her, she looked at her son with the expression he had first seen in her on the night she told him about her father, the expression that was pure and unguarded and a little raw, the expression of someone allowing themselves to want something fully. She looked at Thomas Bishop and then she looked up at Elijah and said, "He is very good," which was her highest form of praise and meant exactly what she said. "He is," Elijah said, and sat beside her on the edge of the bed and took her hand, and they were both quiet in the good way for a while, listening to the sound of the mountain outside and the sound of a new person breathing in the room. The years that followed were the years of the claim's genuine prosperity. With Hazel's documentation and her systematic approach to the hard rock work, and with the expanded operation that they built up over 2 more seasons with additional hired hands and proper equipment, the Copper Ridge claim produced enough to make the Bishops comfortable in a genuine and lasting sense. Not spectacularly wealthy, not the stuff of newspaper stories about Colorado silver barons, but solidly, honestly prosperous in the way that the best things are, built from knowledge and effort and an understanding of what was actually in the ground. Hazel took on the role of what she called the operational manager, which was not a term anyone else in the region used, but which described accurately what she did, overseeing the documentation, managing the accounts, coordinating with the assay office and with Whitfield on the legal maintenance of the claim. She was known in Durango as a woman of serious competence, and she was known on Copper Ridge as the person who had built the most complete geological record of any small mining claim in the San Juan district. This reputation was not without complication. There were men who found it difficult to conduct business with her directly, who addressed themselves to Elijah even when Hazel was the one who had the information they needed. Elijah, who had watched her manage this with patient efficiency for years, developed a habit of directing these men back to her with a pointed pleasantness that he found satisfying, and that she appreciated without making a great deal of it. Because that was also characteristic of her, the refusal to turn a small victory into theater. There were also people in the region, women primarily, who found in Hazel a kind of encouragement, not because she held herself up as an example of anything, but because her existence and her work were a fact that could not be argued with, and facts have a way of being useful to people who need them. The territorial expansion of mining operations in the San Juan district brought more people to the region through the early 1880s, and more people meant more commerce and more of what passed for civilization in the mountains, which had advantages and complications in roughly equal measure. The rail line reached Durango in 1881, which changed the equation for transporting ore and supplies considerably, and Hazel had already accounted for this in her planning, when most of the small operators around them were still adjusting to the idea. Thomas grew from a loud, healthy baby into a serious and curious child, who followed his mother around the claim with the intense observational quality of a small person who is absorbing everything and filing it away for future reference. He was 4 when his sister arrived, a girl they named Clara, and 5 when he began asking questions about the geology of the creek that were genuinely interesting and occasionally unanswerable, which delighted Hazel and kept Elijah humble about how much he had not understood about his own land before she had arrived to explain it. On an evening in the fall of 1884, with Thomas old enough to sit at supper and participate in the conversation, and Clara just beginning to insist on the same privilege, they were sitting at the table in the expanded cabin after supper, the lamp lit and the stove warm and the mountains outside in the early dark of October, and Hazel was going over an updated map of the northeastern vein section with a pencil, and Thomas was asking her about the quartz samples arranged on the windowsill. And Clara had commandeered Elijah's knee and was explaining something complex and largely incomprehensible about an event that had apparently occurred in the yard that afternoon involving a very important rock. Elijah looked around the table. He looked at his daughter on his knee and his son leaning over his mother's map and at Hazel, who was answering Thomas's questions about vein geometry with patient exactitude and simultaneously maintaining half an ear on Clara's narrative, because she was always present in more than one place at once, which was her particular gift. She looked up and caught him watching, and the expression on her face was the one she had learned to allow herself fully in the years they had been married, open and warm and entirely present, the face of a woman who has stopped protecting herself from happiness because she has established, by evidence, that the happiness is real. "What are you thinking about?" she said. "I was thinking about the spring I had a letter that told me I had 1 season to save this claim," he said, "and about who showed up." She considered this. "I showed up because your notice was the only one that offered fair wages," she said. "I know," he said, "but you stayed." She looked at him with that direct brown gaze. "The work was interesting," she said. "Hazel," she smiled, the full unguarded smile. "You were interesting," she said. "The work and the man both." He reached across the table and took her hand, and Thomas looked up briefly with the equanimity of a child accustomed to his parents being affectionate, and then looked back at the map, and Clara was still explaining the important rock incident without apparent awareness that anything else was happening. "I want to ask you something," Elijah said. "You have been asking me things for 5 years," she said. "None of them have been bad." "Are you happy?" he said. She looked at him. She looked at their children and around the cabin and at the map in front of her and out through the window at the mountains in the dark, and when she looked back at him, there was a quality in her face that was quiet and certain and entirely true. "I am the happiest I have ever been," she said, "in every calculation I have made." He pressed his hand over hers on the table. "So am I," he said. Outside the cabin, Copper Ridge held its ground against the dark, and the season with the patient endurance of stone that has been in one place for a very long time and intends to remain. The creek ran below in the dark, carrying its gold toward the sluice that stood empty and waiting for spring, carrying the cold water of the mountains down through the valley the way it had always done. The quartz vein ran northeast into the hillside, rich and real, documented and mapped and belonging to the people in the lit cabin who had known it properly, and worked it honestly, and found in it the foundation for a life that was better than any of them had first imagined. Thomas Bishop, who was his grandfather's namesake, and who would grow up to know this mountain the way few people know any ground, would remember this winter as the one in which his mother taught him the names of all the minerals in the windowsill collection, and his father taught him the names of all the stars visible from the cabin door. And the two of them together had taught him without ever quite saying so that the best things in the world are arrived at through knowledge and patience, and the willingness to do the work honestly and see it through. Gerald Hawthorne, for what it was worth, had turned his attentions elsewhere. His operation had moved east toward newer strikes, and his competing interest in Copper Ridge had been formally closed in the county records, a small legal notation that Hazel had confirmed and filed away in the documentation log with no more ceremony than any other entry, because it was simply the record reflecting the truth of things, which was all any record should do. Whitfield sent a letter from time to time with legal updates about the district, and Pete Rowan appeared every spring and left every fall with the reliable seasonality of a migratory bird and a very capable miner, and the bishops of Copper Ridge went on building a life in the mountains that was theirs in the most complete sense, built from what was real in the ground and what was true between them. From the skilled hands of a woman who had shown up with more to offer than anyone had expected, and the open hands of a man who had been ready to receive it. On the morning of Thomas's 5th birthday, which fell in late October, the first hard snow of the season came down overnight and covered everything in white. Thomas woke early and stood at the window in his nightclothes looking at the transformed world with the intense absorption of a child experiencing something for the first time that he is certain is important. And Elijah, who had woken when he heard the small feet on the floor, stood behind him and put a hand on his small shoulder. "It snows every year," Elijah said. Thomas looked at the white mountain. "I know," he said, "but it looks different every time." Elijah looked at his son's face in the window glass, and then at the mountain beyond it, and thought that there was something exactly right about that observation, something that applied to more than snow and mountains, something about the nature of the best things, that they reveal something new each time you look at them carefully. Hazel appeared in the doorway of their room in her dressing gown with Clara on her hip, Clara having recently discovered that the earliest possible morning was the most interesting time, and she looked at Elijah and her son standing at the window in the snow light, and she said, quietly, so as not to break the moment, "What are you looking at?" "Everything," Elijah said. She came to stand beside him. Clara transferred to his free arm, where she immediately grabbed a fist of his shirt and began studying the snow with Thomas-like intensity. And Hazel's hand found his at his side, and she leaned slightly against him. And they stood together looking at the mountain in its snow, and at the creek visible below as a dark line through the white, and at the sky that was the pale particular color of a mountain sky after a first snow, and at the vein scar on the hillside that was white now like everything else but was still there, still running northeast, still holding what it had always held. The claim was theirs. The mountain was known. The work was ongoing in the best possible way, the way of a life that has found its shape and intends to keep it. Elijah Bishop and Hazel Hale Bishop stood with their children in the early mountain morning, and there was nothing between them that was unresolved, nothing left waiting, nothing owed to the future that was not already being paid by the living of each day. It was exactly enough, which is to say it was everything.